Good afternoon from southeastern Finland, Northern Europe. I continue my series of historical events videos, and this time I want to go up by 5 years, starting from 1944. My main source for these videos is the English language Wikipedia, which has articles on the events of many years. 1944, as we know, was the last full year of the Second World War. During that year, Germany and Italy and Japan all suffered clear defeats. Italy had officially surrendered already back in 1943, but northern Italy was still, and even parts of central Italy, including the Italian capital Rome, were still in the hands of the fascists and Nazis, and only gradually were they pushed northward. In the summer of 1944, Rome fell to the Allies for good, and then the titular puppet regime of Italian Social Republic or something like that, nominally headed by the already virtually deposed Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, still held power technically in northern Italy. Germany had to retreat from France, almost the entire France, during the second half of 1944. And then the Soviet Union launched an invasion of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Eastern Europe in June 1944, pushing the German soldiers kilometer by kilometer eastward, so that by the end of 1944, Germany's military situation looked very bleak. Germany had lost all of its allies, we can say, not counting the puppet state of Slovakia, because Hungary was falling, or had largely or mostly fallen already to the Soviet armies. Romania and Bulgaria had surrendered. Yugoslavia, one of whose regions, Croatia, had been a puppet state loyal to the Axis, had fallen to communist forces, whose leader, Mr. Josip Broz Tito, would become Yugoslavia's longtime dictator. Albania had fallen already to the Allies. Greece had been freed as well. But because Germany was still headed officially by the increasingly bizarrely and inconsistently behaving and the increasingly psychologically troubled Führer or leader, Adolf Hitler, there was little realistic hope for a peace. A group of conservative-minded German officers of the army, and then in the background there were conservatively minded German politicians or former politicians who believed that Hitler had gone too far in his policies, tried to salvage what they could salvage by choosing one of them, or actually by having one of them volunteer to bring a bomb in a briefcase to Hitler's military situation briefing that was held near Rastenburg in East Prussia, now that's located in Poland, on July the 20th, 1944. And we, of course, know what happened, because the officer Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was also an aristocrat, a count by his rank, had lost his right hand and 2 fingers of his left hand in North Africa in 1943. While fighting there, he was only able to prepare one of the 2 bombs. If he had been able to prepare 2 of those bombs, or if the day had not been so hot as to persuade Hitler to hold the military situations briefing in a wooden hut whose windows were open because apparently the hut had no electronic ventilation. Then Hitler would have been killed, and well, possibly technically, if one of the 4 people who were killed by the explosion, 20 survived, some with serious injuries. But if that officer who would lose his legs and his life in the explosion had not moved with one of his legs the briefcase further away from Hitler, then Hitler could still have been killed. Of course, even if Hitler had been killed, and even if all of the people present had been killed, that would not automatically have defeated the Nazi regime in Germany. However, there could have been direct or indirect peace negotiations, because the leader, who would have been either Marshal Hermann Göring or the SS organizations or SS officers leader, Mr. Heinrich Himmler, would have been more sympathetic than Hitler to opening at least informal negotiations with the Western Allies, the Americans, Britons, and Free French soldiers and politicians. Okay, let's go to the actual events now after this lengthy introduction. So 1944 was a leap year. In other words, a 366-day year starting on Saturday of the Gregorian calendar. On January the 2nd, the Free French general, Mr. Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, was appointed to command French Army B, part of the 6th United States Army Group in North Africa. Landing at Sidor, 13,000 US and Australian troops landed on Papua New Guinea in Oceania in an attempt to cut off a Japanese retreat. On January the 8th, the Philippine Commonwealth troops entered the province of Ilocos Sur in northern Luzon, Luzon being the northernmost of the Philippines' main islands, and attacked Japanese forces. Then, on January the 14th, Soviet troops started the offensive at Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg and Novgorod. On January the 20th, the British Royal Air Force dropped 2,300 tons of bombs on Berlin. On January the 27th, the 2-year, or actually more than 2-year, siege of Leningrad in northwestern Soviet Union was lifted. On February the 1st, Pacific War, the United States troops landed in the Marshall Islands in Oceania. On February the 14th, an anti-Japanese revolt broke out on Java. On February the 26th, Mr. Kurt Geron began filming the Nazi propaganda film Theresienstadt in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, now located in the Czech Republic. He and many others who were featured in it were transferred to Auschwitz and gassed or killed by gas upon the film's completion. The Theresienstadt was a so-called model concentration camp where the prisoners were, at least in the eyes of outside observers, treated relatively leniently compared to the forms of treatment of most other concentration camps. Still, many prisoners eventually died even in Theresienstadt. Sue S. Dawser or Dowser became the first woman appointed to the substantive rank of captain in the United States Navy Nurse Corps. In March 1944, an Austrian-born economist Friedrich Hayek published his book The Road to Serfdom in London. On March the 1st, an anti-fascist strike began in northern Italy. On March the 9th, Soviet army planes attacked Tallinn, Estonia's capital in the Baltic region of northern Europe, killing 757 and leaving 25,000 homeless. On March the 10th in Britain, the prohibition on married women working as teachers was lifted. On April the 2nd, the Usk massacre took place in France. Members of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, or Hitler Youth Organization, shot 85 civilians suspected of blowing up their train on its approach to the Gare d'Usk, or the train station of Usk in France. On April the 10th, 1944, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler escaped from the Auschwitz concentration camp, which is located currently in or near the city of Oświęcim in southern Poland. From April the 25th to 27th, they prepared the Vrba-Wetzler report, one of the earliest and most detailed descriptions of the extermination of Jews in the camp. In May 1944, the French existentialist philosopher and communist writer Mr. Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist drama No Exit, Huis Clos premiered in Nazi-occupied Paris. On May the 1st, 200 communist prisoners were shot by the Germans at Kaisariani, Athens, Greece, in reprisal for the killing of General Franz Krech by partisans at Molaoi. On May the 5th, Mohandas, or Mahatma Gandhi, an Indian lawyer, writer, and civil rights activist and pro-independence activist, was released from jail in India on health grounds. On May the 12th, the Soviet troops finalized the liberation of the Crimea, a peninsula surrounded by the northern parts of the Black Sea. From May the 15th to July the 8th, Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps. On May the 18th, the Battle of Monte Cassino took place, or began. The Germans evacuated that city or town in Italy, and the Allied forces led by Mr. Władysław Anders from the Polish Second Corps took the stronghold after a struggle that had claimed 20,000 lives. On June the 1st, 1944, the British Broadcasting Corporation transmitted a coded message, the first line of the poem Chanson d'automne, or Song of Autumn, by Paul Verlaine, to the French resistance, warning that the invasion of continental Europe was imminent. On June the 3rd, Hans Asperger published his paper on Asperger syndrome. On June the 4th, Rome, Italy's old capital, fell to the Allies, the first Axis capital to fall. On June the 5th, 1944, the German Navy's Enigma messages were decoded in almost real time. British Group Captain James Stagg correctly forecasted a brief improvement in weather conditions over the English Channel, which would permit the following day's Normandy landings in northwestern France to take place. Otherwise, the Normandy invasion would have had to be postponed by 2 weeks or so. At 10:15 p.m. local time, the BBC transmitted the second line of the Paul Verlaine poem Chanson d'automne to the French resistance, indicating that the invasion of continental Europe was about to begin. Over 1,000 British bombers dropped 5,000 tons of bombs on German gun batteries on the Normandy coast in preparation for D-Day. And then on June the 6th, 1944, 155,000 Allied troops shipped from Britain landed on the beaches of Normandy in northern or northwestern France, beginning Operation Overlord and the invasion of Normandy. They quickly broke through the Atlantic Wall and pushed inland in the largest amphibious military operation in history. This operation would help liberate France from Germany and would also weaken the Nazi hold on Europe. On June the 9th, 1944, the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin launched a smaller invasion against Finland with the intent of defeating Finland before pushing for Berlin. On June the 10th, in the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre, 642 men, women, and children were killed in France. On June the 13th, Germany launched the first V-1 flying bomb attack on London. On June the 15th, the United States forces landed on Saipan, which is an island in the Pacific Ocean in the Marianas Archipelago, and is administered by the United States as a region or an island of the Northern Mariana Islands. On June the 16th, at age 14, George Stinney, so just 14, George Stinney became the youngest person ever executed in the United States. George Stinney was an African-American boy. He had been born in October 1929 in Pinewood, South Carolina. He was executed in Columbia, South Carolina. He was charged with and convicted on a first-degree murder. Allegedly, he had murdered Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. They were white American girls aged 7 and 11. The court refused to hear his appeal, and the appeals on his behalf to the governor for clemency or pardon were denied. He is still, 75 years later, the youngest American to be sentenced to death and executed. In 2004, a team of legal experts began to re-examine the Stinney case, and several individuals at Northeastern University School of Law organized to seek a judicial review. His conviction was vacated in 2014 when a court ruled that he had not received a fair trial. So, Betty Binnicker and Mary Thames, aged 11 and 7 respectively, were found dead in the company mill town of Alkaloo, South Carolina in March 1944, not having returned to their homes the night before. Police officers arrested the 14-year-old George Stinney as a suspect. They said that he confessed to the crime to them. However, there was no written record of his confession apart from notes provided by an investigating deputy. No transcript was recorded of the brief trial. Stinney was convicted of first-degree murder of the two girls in under 10 minutes by an all-white jury during a 2-hour trial. The court refused to hear his appeal, and he was executed in June 1944, still aged 14, by electric chair. In the decades since Stinney's conviction and execution, the question of his guilt, the validity of his reported confession, and the judicial process leading to his execution have been extensively criticized. A group of lawyers and activists investigated the Stinney case on behalf of his family. In 2013, the family petitioned for a new trial. In December 2014, his conviction was posthumously vacated 70 years after his execution because the circuit court judge ruled that he had not been given a fair trial. He had no effective defense representation, and his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated. The judgment noted that while Stinney could have committed the crime, the prosecution and trial were fundamentally flawed. Judge Mullen ruled that his confession was likely coerced and thus inadmissible. She also found that the execution of a 14-year-old constituted a cruel and unusual punishment. And we have to remember that in South Carolina and in almost all other southern US states back in 1944, the African American residents were second-class citizens. Almost none of them were permitted to vote. There were various ways to prevent them from voting, such as the so-called grandfather clauses, which enfranchised poor and in some cases only lightly or totally uneducated and even illiterate white American citizens of those states because their grandfathers had had the right to vote. Then there were literacy tests, which of course also cracked down on the potential number of African Americans entitled to vote, because just like in the grandfather clauses case, many of them were in an unfavorable position. Many African Americans of voting age in most southern US states, still in the 1940s, had only received just elementary education, and many had not even completed that. And the elementary education normally was clearly inferior to that offered to even the poor white children, because the schools were segregated in most southern US states. Also, then there were tests where the potential African American voters were asked to read and interpret lengthy portions of the state constitutions, while the white voters were normally not asked such questions. Then there was a trick to deny the right to vote, especially to the destitute, financially destitute African American voters, the poll tax. And finally, for those rather few African American voters who passed all these hurdles, which were clearly discriminatory and wrong, immoral even, because they were not normally imposed on even the poor white American voters, there was still the possibility that they could be denied the right to vote, or then their votes would simply not have been counted or would have been judged as either classified as either blank or spoiled, or they could be lynched or then beaten up. And in one tragic case, an African American man who had served as a soldier of the United States Army in Europe in the Second World War, this I read in one history book about the United States after the Second World War. I can't remember the author for sure. Could have been William Chafe. When I was studying the North American Studies, a multidisciplinary subject at Helsinki University in Finland, Northern Europe, in the 1990s. But this African American veteran soldier who tried to vote was blinded by sticks. And these abuses remained largely intact until the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which legally ended the racial discrimination and segregation in the southern US states, although in practice they still continue to a greater or lesser degree, because most of the so-called public schools, in other words, the schools funded by the state's taxpayers, are attended by the ethnic and racial minority students, especially African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and in some cases Native Americans, and the poor white Americans. While then the more prestigious schools, whether public sector ones or private ones, are largely attended by the children of white upper middle class and upper class white Americans. Although, of course, the number of African American, Hispanic American, and other minority students is increasing. Okay, at the time of these murders or manslaughters of the two girls, young girls, George Stinney Jr. was living in Alkaloo, Clarendon County, South Carolina. He was 14 years old. He was living with his father, George Stinney Sr., mother Amy, brothers John, 17, and Charles, 12, and sisters Catherine, 10, and Amy, 7. George Sr. was working at the town's sawmill, and the family was residing in company housing. Alkaloo was a small working-class mill town where white and black neighborhoods were separated by railroad tracks. The town was typical of small southern United States towns of the time. Given segregated schools and churches for white and black residents, relatively few of them interacted regularly with each other. On March the 23rd, 1944, several hours or about one day after they had not returned home, the bodies of 11-year-old Betty Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Thames were found in a ditch on the African American side of Alkaloo. The night before, they had not returned to their homes. The senior George Stinney helped in the search. The girls had been beaten with a weapon, variously reported as a piece of blunt metal or a railroad spike. The girls were last seen riding their bicycles looking for flowers. As they passed the Stinney property, they had asked young George Stinney and his sister Amy if they knew where to find maypops, a local name for passion flowers. According to Amy, she was with George at the time the police later established for the murders. According to an article reported by the Wire Services on March the 24th, 1944, and published widely, with the mistake of the boy's name preserved, he was called mistakenly George Junius instead of George Stinney. The sheriff announced the arrest and said that this George Junius or George Stinney had confessed and led others to a hidden piece of iron. Both girls had suffered blunt force trauma to the face and head. Reports differed as to what kind of weapon had been used. According to a report by the medical examiner, these wounds had been inflicted by a blunt instrument with a round head about the size of a hammer. Well, given the fact that George Stinney Jr. was only 14 at the time, and given the possibility that he was not a strongly built boy for his age, it would have been quite difficult for him to inflict such damage, fatal damage on the two young girls with a hammer or with a hammer-sized object. The medical examiner reported no evidence of sexual assault to the younger girl, although the older girl's genitalia were slightly bruised. George Stinney and his older brother Johnny were arrested on suspicion of murdering the girls. The police did release Johnny, interestingly enough, because Johnny, aged 17, would probably have been physically clearly more capable of killing the girls brutally than the 14-year-old George Jr. George Jr. was held. The police officers refused to allow him to see his parents until after his trial and conviction. According to a handwritten statement, the arresting officer was H.S. Newman, a Clarendon County deputy, who stated that he had arrested George Stinney, who had then confessed to him and had told him where to find a piece of iron about 15 inches, where he said he had put it in a ditch about 6 feet from the bicycle. However, there is no known existing confession statement signed by Stinney. The 14-year-old claimed later that the arresting officers starved him and then bribed him with food to confess. Well, given the generally speaking brutal treatment of many African Americans by especially rabidly racist and anti-African American white police officers, or white men in general at the time, this was certainly not inconceivable. And they may even have threatened to beat him up or beat him to death, because clearly African Americans, whether they were children or teenagers or adults, were second-class citizens, and they were also told by many white American authorities in most southern US states to stay in their place, to accept their socially, educationally, professionally, and otherwise inferior, even medically inferior status. It was reported that George had fought with other students at school, including a fight where he had scratched a girl with a knife. This assertion by Stinney's 7th grade teacher, who was also an African American, was disputed by Amy Stinney Ruffner when it was reported in 1995. A local white woman who remembered Stinney from childhood said in 2014 that Stinney had threatened to kill her and her friend the day before the murder, and that he was known as a bully. After George Jr. was arrested, George Sr. was fired from his job at the local sawmill, and the Stinney family had to immediately vacate their company housing and feared for their safety. The community, as well as the police, threatened to lynch their other children if they did not leave immediately. His parents did not see George again before the trial. He had no support during his 81-day confinement and trial. He was detained at a jail in Colombia, 50 miles or about 80 kilometers from Al-Kalou, due to the risk of lynching. Stinney was questioned alone, without his parents or an attorney. Although the Sixth Amendment guarantees legal counsel, it was not until 1963 that Gideon versus Wainwright explicitly required representation through the course of criminal proceedings. The entire proceeding against Stinney, including jury selection, took 1 day. Stinney's court-appointed defense counsel was Charles Plowden, a tax commissioner campaigning for election to local office. Plowden did not challenge the 3 police officers who testified that Stinney confessed to the 2 murders, despite this being the only evidence against him. He did not challenge even the prosecution's presentation of 2 differing versions of Stinney's verbal confession. In one version, the girls attacked Stinney after he had tried to help one girl who had fallen in the ditch, and he had killed them in self-defense. And given the fact that he was only 14 years old, this already should have either exonerated him in the sense, with the probability that he would still have had to go through, for example, anger management courses, or then possibly he should have been enrolled at a school for children and teenagers with special needs or something like that. Or possibly he would have had to complete schooling at a correctional facility. Or then he would have been given a lenient sentence had he shown remorse for the alleged killings. First, in the other version, he had followed the girls, first attacking Mary and then Betty. However, there was no physical evidence linking him to the murders. As most African Americans were still disenfranchised and prohibited from voting, they could not be selected as jurors. Over 1,000 whites crowded the courtroom, but no African Americans were allowed. Other than the testimony of the 3 police officers at trial, the prosecutors called 3 witnesses: Reverend Francis Batson, who discovered the 2 girls' bodies, and the 2 doctors who performed the post-mortem examination. Judge Philip H. Stoll sentenced Stinney to death by electrocution. There is no existing transcript of the trial, and no appeal was filed by his defense attorney. Stinney's family churches and the NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of the Colored People, appealed to Governor Olin D. Johnston for clemency given the boy's age. Others urged the governor to let the execution proceed, which he did. Johnston wrote in a response to one appeal for clemency that it may be interesting for you to know that Stinney killed the smaller girl to rape the larger one. Then he killed the larger girl and raped her dead body. 20 minutes later, he returned and attempted to rape her again, but her body was too cold. All of this he admitted himself. However, the medical examiner's report supported none of those assertions. Between the time of Stinney's arrest and his execution, Stinney's parents only could see him once, after the trial when he was held in the Columbia Penitentiary. Under the threat of lynching, they could not meet him again. George Stinney Jr. was executed at the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia on June the 16th at 7:30 p.m. local time. He was only 155 centimeters or 5 feet and 1 inch tall and weighed just over 90 pounds or 40 kilograms. And given his short stature, it was quite inconceivable that he could have lifted especially a heavy hammer-sized object to fatally wound those girls. It would have been much likelier that had he tried to hit the girls, he would probably have missed them, especially if the girls had still been conscious and able to spring aside. Stinney was actually so small compared to the usual adult prisoners that law officers had difficulty securing him to the frame holding the electrodes. Stinney was made to sit on a Bible that he was carrying in order to fit properly into the chair. The state's adult-sized face mask did not fit him, as he was hit with the first 2,400 volt surge of electricity. The mask covering his face slipped off, revealing the 3rd-degree burns on his face and head. Stinney was declared dead within 8 minutes of the initial electrocution. From the time of the murders until Stinney's execution, 83 days had passed. In 2004, George Frierson, a local historian who grew up in Alcaloo, started researching the case after reading a newspaper article about it. His work gained the attention of South Carolina lawyers Steve McKenzie and Matt Burgess. In addition, Ray Brown, attorney James Moon, and others contributed countless hours of research and review of historical documents and found witnesses and evidence to assist in exonerating Stinney. Among those who aided the case were the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, CRRJ, at Northeastern University School of Law, which filed an amicus brief with the court in 2014. Frierson and the pro bono lawyers first sought relief through the Pardon and Parole Board of South Carolina. McKenzie and Burgess, along with attorney Ray Chandler, representing Stinney's family, filed a motion for a new trial on October the 25th, 2013. And then the long story short was that posthumously the conviction was vacated on December the 17th, 2014. Family members of both Betty Binnicker and Mary Thames expressed disappointment at the court's ruling. They said that although they acknowledged Stinney's execution at the age of 14 to be controversial, they never doubted the boy's guilt. The niece of Betty Binnicker claimed she and her family had extensively researched the case and argued that people who just read these articles in the newspaper did not know the truth. Binnicker's niece alleged that in the early 1990s, a police officer who had arrested Stinney had contacted her saying, "Don't you ever believe that boy didn't kill your aunt?" These family members said that the claims of a deathbed confession from an individual confessing to the girl's murders have never been substantiated. But we go on. Returning to 1944. Sorry for the long digression. On June the 7th, years after it had entered a so-called personal union, that is full self-government in its domestic affairs, but still a shared ruler, currency and foreign policy with Denmark, Iceland declared full independence from Denmark, which at the time, the mainland Denmark, was occupied by Germany, as it had been since April 1940. Iceland became a republic, and it is these 75 years later, in practice, a parliamentary republic where the president exercises mostly ceremonial and symbolic duties, while the prime minister or the head of government is Iceland's executive leader. On June the 22nd, 1944, in Operation Bagration, a general attack by the Soviet forces cleared the German forces from Belarus or White Russia, resulting in the German Army Group Center's destruction, possibly the German land armies or Wehrmacht's greatest defeat during the Second World War. In the Burma campaign, Burma now is called Myanmar in Southeastern Asia, the Battle of Kohima ended in a British victory. On June the 23rd, Mr. Maurice Rossel of the International Committee of the Red Cross visited the so-called model concentration camp of Theresienstadt, uncritically accepting the propaganda view of it presented by the Schutzstaffel. On June the 24th, a Polish Jewish-born activist who had lived in what is now Israel since 1906 or something like that, Mr. David Ben-Gurion, or originally David Grün, presented the 1 million plan to the Jewish Agency for Israel, proposing a million-strong Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim countries, as well as from Europe to mandatory Palestine. Mr. Ben-Gurion would serve as the modern Israel's first prime minister from 1948 to 1954, and again from 1955 until his retirement in 1963. He belonged to the Social Democratic Labour Party, or MAPAI. On June the 25th, the Battle of Tali-Ihantala in two villages located roughly 10 to 15 kilometers to the north and northeast of the former Finnish city of Viipuri or Viborg began, and by July the 13th or some similar date in early June 1944, it resulted in a major Finnish defensive victory over the invading Soviet troops, although at a heavy cost. And this was the beginning of the end of the Great Soviet Summer Offensive of 1944 to capture Finland. Already during July 1944, the Soviet dictator Stalin started to withdraw Soviet troops from the Finnish front so that he could more effectively and quickly conquer the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, or reconquer them, and then Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, or at least most of the rest of Eastern Europe. On June the 26th, American troops entered Cherbourg in northern or northwestern France. From July to October 1944, the Germans were driven out of Lithuania, leading to re-imposition of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. On July the 1st, the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference began at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States, resulting in, for example, the implementation in many, if not most, Western democracies after the Second World War of the so-called Keynesian financial and economic policies, where most governments stimulated the economy when it was either in a recession or in a slowdown by cutting taxes and increasing spending, and then when it was in a boom, they restricted the monetary supply, raised taxes, and cut spending to balance the budget, or at least bring it closer to balance. On July the 3rd, 1944, the Soviet troops conquered Minsk, Belarusi's capital. On July the 9th, the British and Canadian troops captured Caen in northern or northwestern France. On July the 10th, the Soviet troops started to reconquer the Baltic countries. From July the 12th to 21st, in the Debrecen massacre, 35 or 36 French civilians were killed by Ostlegionen, or Cossacks serving with the German army. On July the 18th, Mr. Hideki Tojo resigned as Prime Minister of Japan due to numerous setbacks in the war effort, and was succeeded on July the 22nd by Kuniaki Koiso. On July the 20th, 1944, Adolf Hitler survived the July the 20th plot to assassinate him, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg. On July the 21st, American troops landed on Guam, and the battle was concluded on August the 10th. On July the 22nd, the Bretton Woods Conference ended with agreements signed to set up the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and International Monetary Fund. In the United States versus Masaki Kuwabara case, the only Japanese-American draft avoidance case was to be dismissed on a due process violation of the US Constitution. On July the 26th, a Messerschmitt Me-262 became the first jet fighter aircraft to have an operational victory. On August the 1st, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising by thousands of patriotic and nationalist Polish soldiers and volunteers began. At that time, units of the Red Army, or the Soviet Army, were on the eastern outskirts of Warsaw, but because Stalin had ordered them not to help these Polish fighters, 2 months later, the Warsaw Uprising failed, and then Hitler ordered Warsaw to be basically destroyed. And indeed, when the Soviets entered it in January 1945, it was basically a ghost town, which means that many, if not most, of the buildings in Warsaw have been constructed since 1945. On August the 2nd, 1944, Turkey broke off diplomatic and economic relations with Germany. On August the 3rd, the Education Act in the United Kingdom, promoted by Rab or Richard Austin Butler, I think, created a tripartite system of education in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. On August the 4th, a 15-year-old German Jewish girl who had been living with her parents and sister Margot in the neutral and tolerant Netherlands since 1934, Anne Frank was betrayed by a Dutch collaborator of the Nazis. The entire family was arrested, and then they had to go to concentration camps. Of the Frank family, the immediate family of Anne Frank, only her father Otto survived and lived, I think, until 1980. They also found others in hiding, and all those others, their friends, also died in the Holocaust. On August the 7th, the IBM dedicated the first program-controlled calculator, the automatic sequence-controlled calculator, known best as the Harvard Mark I. On August the 12th, the Allies captured Florence or Firenze in northern Italy. On August the 19th, over 4,400 Japanese servicemen drowned when USS Spadefish torpedoed Tamatsu Maru. An insurrection started in Paris. On August the 23rd, 1944, King Michael of Romania dismissed the authoritarian pro-Nazi Prime Minister, Colonel Ion Antonescu. Arresting him, a new government was established. Romania left the Axis powers and instead joined the Soviet Union and allies. In the Padula di Fucecchio massacre, at least 174 Italian civilians were killed by the German Army's 23rd Infantry Division. On August the 24th, 1944, the Allies entered Paris, France's capital, successfully completing Operation Overlord. Japanese vessels attacked and sank the submarine USS Harder off Luzon, the Philippines' northernmost main island. On August the 25th, General Dietrich von Holtitz surrendered Paris formally to the Allies, although Hitler had ordered him to destroy it. In the Maillet massacre in Indre-et-Loire, 129 civilians, 70% of them women and children, were massacred by the Gestapo. Hungary decided to continue the war together with Germany. On August the 29th, 1944, the Slovak national uprising against the Axis powers began. In September 1944, the Dutch famine or Hongar Winter, meaning hunger winter, began in the occupied northern part of the Netherlands. On September the 2nd, diarist Anne Frank and her family were placed on the last transport train from Westerbork to Auschwitz concentration camp, where they arrived 3 days later. On September the 3rd, the Allies liberated Brussels, Belgium's capital. On September the 4th, Finland implemented an armistice on its side of the front line against the Soviet Union, having broken off or decided to break off diplomatic relations with Germany on September the 2nd. Not until the morning of September the 5th did all firing by Soviet troops cease, with the result that some 20 Finnish soldiers died because of carelessness, and several were lost, and tens were still wounded. On September the 6th, 1944, Tartu a city in southern Estonia, was captured by Soviet forces. On September the 7th, the Belgian government in exile returned to Brussels from London. On September the 8th, the first V-2 rocket attack on London took place. On September the 10th, Luxembourg was liberated. On September the 13th, the Battle of Meligalas began between the Greek resistance forces of the Greek People's Liberation Army and the collaborationist security battalions. On September the 15th, the Battle of Peleliu began in the Pacific. On September the 19th, 1944, Finland and the Soviet Union signed a treaty ending the continuation war after over 3 years. Finland agreed to surrender once again most of Karelia, then the Porkkala naval base to the west of Helsinki, which was returned by the Soviet Union to Finland in January 1956, then also parts of the northeastern towns of Salla and Kuusamo, and then the entire Petsamo or Petsenga Peninsula, thus cutting Finland off its ice-free port on the Arctic Ocean's southern shore. Finland would later sell the small area of Jäniskoski and Niskakoski, or Hare Rapids and Neck Rapids, to the Soviet Union in northern Lapland. Finland also agreed to pay a $300 million indemnity or war reparation payment. At that time, the products, however, were priced according to the 1938 levels, which meant that in practice, Finland ended up paying some $600 million at that time, and much more, of course, in today's inflated US dollars. Most of these products had to be steel products, such as trains and ships. Finland also agreed to prosecute those wartime political leaders who had abused their offices for the fatherland's harm and who had knowingly opposed the Allied, meaning in practice the Soviet Union. In addition, some 160 members of the so-called Allied Control Commission arrived to Helsinki, Finland, almost entirely composed of Soviets. Only a few British delegates were allowed there, and they wanted to make sure that the Finnish president and government would implement this peace treaty. Also, Finland agreed to outlaw all fascist, Hitler-right, and anti-Soviet organizations, which meant the banning of all extreme right parties, none of which had ever gained a major following in Finland, all the other far-right organizations, but sadly also two voluntary national defense organizations, neither one of which was composed mainly of far-rightists. The men's civil guards, and then the women's Lotta Svärd. Also, Finland agreed to re-legalize its Communist Party and other far-left organizations, which had been outlawed in November 1930 under pressure from the far-right Lapua movement. On September the 22nd, 1944, the Red Army captured Tallinn, Estonia's capital. Prime Minister Jüri Uluots, acting in duties of the Estonian president, and 80,000 Estonian civilians managed to escape to Sweden and Germany. Almost the entire Swedish minority escaped Estonia. On October the 2nd, 1944, German Nazi troops ended the Warsaw Uprising, which was followed by Warsaw's virtual destruction. On October the 6th, the Battle of Debrecen started in southern Hungary on the Eastern Front and lasted until October the 29th. On October the 9th, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin began a 9-day conference in Moscow to discuss Europe's future. On October the 10th, 800 Romani or Gypsy children were systematically murdered at the Auschwitz concentration camp. On October the 13th, Riga, Latvia's capital in the Baltic region of Northern Europe, was taken by the Red Army. On October the 14th, the popular and even admired by many Allied leaders, including Winston Churchill, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, also nicknamed the Desert Fox because he had led the German operations for some years in the North African deserts, ultimately losing to the Allied, committed suicide because he was linked to the July the 20th plot. However, contrary to many or most of the plotters, he did not favor assassinating Hitler, but rather bringing Hitler to trial for his many crimes. Since Hitler realized how popular Rommel was and how huge outcry his possible execution would cause in Germany, he decided to give Rommel two choices. Either Rommel could resist arrest or anyway refuse to commit suicide, in which case he would be tried, condemned, and executed. His family would also be arrested. Or he could quietly commit suicide, in which case he would be given a state funeral and his family would be left alone. He chose, probably with great difficulty, the second option. And indeed, his family was allowed to escape arrest. On October the 18th, the Volkssturm Nazi militia was founded on Adolf Hitler's orders, consisting of underage boys under the age of 18, and then men aged 60 and over. On October the 20th, 1944, Belgrade, the Yugoslav capital, was liberated by Yugoslav partisans together with the Bulgarian army and the Red Army. American forces landed on Red Beach in Palo Leyte as General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines with Philippine Commonwealth President Sergio Osmeña and Armed Forces of the Philippines Generals Basilio J. Valdez and Carlos P. Romulo. On October the 21st, 1944, Aachen, the first German city to fall, was captured by American troops. On October the 25th, 1944, the Soviet Red Army liberated Kirkenes, a town in far northern Norway. On October the 30th, Anne Frank and her sister Margot were deported from Auschwitz to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where they would both die. From November the 1st to December the 7th, 1944, delegates of 52 nations met at the International Civil Aviation Conference in Chicago, Illinois, the United States, to plan for post-war international cooperation, framing the constitution of the International Civil Aviation Organization. On November the 7th, 1944, the incumbent US President Franklin Roosevelt, who had been in office since March 1933 and was for the fourth time the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, managed to win a fourth term, albeit with his lowest share of the presidential election vote, 53%, compared to 57% in 1932, 60% in 1936, and 55% in 1940. His Republican challenger, Governor of New York State, Thomas Dewey received 46% of the vote. The Democrats were able to retain fairly narrow majorities in both houses of US Congress. The new vice president-elect was Missouri Senator Harry Truman, who obviously then resigned from the US Senate, effective in January 1945. Truman would succeed Roosevelt under 3 months into Roosevelt's fourth term on April the 12th, 1945, when Roosevelt, whose health had been failing already since at least 1940, died suddenly from a cerebral hemorrhage in Georgia. And since the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, the US presidents have only been allowed to serve 2 terms or 8 years, under exceptional circumstances, a maximum of 10 years. On November the 12th, 1944, the German battleship Tirpitz was sunk by British Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers. Estimated casualties ranged from 950 to 1,204. On November the 22nd, 1944, the Canadian Prime Minister and Liberal Party's leader, Mackenzie King, agreed a one-time conscription levy in Canada for overseas service. On November the 29th, submarine USS Archer Fish sank Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano. Shinano was the largest carrier built to this date and would remain through the 20th century the largest ship sunk by a submarine. On December the 1st, 1944, Edward Stinney Jr. became the last United States Secretary of State or Foreign Secretary of the Roosevelt administration, filling the seat left by Cordell Hull. On December the 13th, in the Battle of Mindoro Island in the Philippines, the United States, Australian, and Philippine Commonwealth troops landed there. On December the 15th, 1944, a popular American band leader, Major Glenn Miller, famous especially for his songs or instrumental pieces In the Mood and The Moonlight Serenade, disappeared in heavy fog over the English Channel while flying to Paris. Or actually, he was not flying, but he was a passenger on board a US AAF utility aircraft. On December the 16th, 1944, Germany began the Ardennes offensive in eastern Belgium, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, which was unsuccessful. On the same day, General George C. Marshall became the first US five-star general. On December the 17th, 1944, in the Malmedy Massacre, German SS troops under Joachim Peiper machine-gunned American prisoners of war captured during the Battle of the Bulge near Malmedy and elsewhere in Belgium. On the same day, in the bombing of Ulm, Germany, 707 people were killed and 25,000 were left homeless. On December the 18th, General Douglas MacArthur became the second US five-star general. On December the 19th, the daily newspaper Le Monde began publication in Paris. Almost 75 years later, it is still being published. On December the 20th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been the operational strategist of the Operation Overlord and would later serve as the 34th US president as a Republican from 1953 to 1961, was promoted to the rank of five-star US general. On December the 24th, troopship SS Leopoldville was sunk in the English Channel by German submarine U-486. Approximately 763 soldiers of the US 66th Infantry Division drowned. Also on December the 24th, in the Bond massacre, 34 men between the ages of 17 and 32 were executed by the Sicherheitsdienst or security service near Bond in Belgium in retaliation for the killing of 3 German soldiers. On December the 26th, 1944, American troops repulsed German forces at Bastogne, and Asztergom in Hungary was captured by the Soviets. On December the 31st, in the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines, tens of thousands of Imperial Japanese Army soldiers were killed in action in a significant victory for the Allied and Filipinos.